Okay, as quickly as possible here. I am not affiliated with the College Board in any way. I don't even teach AP Literature anymore. I did for many years, and it's been a couple of years since I last taught this particular course. But I'm still really interested in the exam. I like to see what prompts they issue, and they just came out this last weekend. So I thought I would sort of formalize my reaction this time by recording a short walkthrough of how I might respond to it. I will probably miss a lot of things that other people caught and wrote about very effectively. So just because I don't mention it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to write about. Just because I do mention it doesn't mean that it is a good thing to write about. It's just one English teacher's approach. I don't have access to the poem, or I have access, I don't have the rights to display the poem. I'm assuming you do. You can pull it up. You probably are familiar with it already, having tested for it or taught it perhaps. You might have that in front of you. You might have the prompt in front of you as well. I'm just quoting sort of piecemeal from the prompt itself here. So quickly as possible here, here's how I break down the prompt. I like to look at the things that it's asking you to observe, what sort of elements of language on the page that you can point to, the concrete side of the poem. What do they want you to look at? And then I like to look at the side of the prompt that asks you, that directs you toward a particular kind of abstraction, an inference, either in emotion or feeling, the tone of a place or a person, or towards an idea. More often than not, these are going to be asking for you to talk about the emotional aspects of a poem, not the themes. And that's what we have here. We're looking for a complex portrayal of the landlady. What does that mean? That doesn't mean difficult. It just means they want you to be able to look at her as more than a two-dimensional figure. How is she human? How is she complicated? How does she contradict herself? How is she surprising? That's something a lot of people will probably have trouble with. They might read this and say, oh, well, she's just a busybody, and she's annoying, and she's a trespasser, she's a thief, and it will be difficult for some people to sort of see beyond that surface level, but I think there is grounds to go beyond that here. On the left side, they don't give you a lot of hints here about what elements to look at. Imagery is sort of a nice one. People know pictures when they see them, so that's kind of reassuring. Selection of detail, I don't know what that is. I guess that's sort of, these are going to overlap, I think. Test makers don't really care what you're calling them when you write these out. They just want you to identify language and respond to it in a way that is surprising and personal. Tone, I could make a whole video about that. I really don't think tone counts as a technique. I might be alone in this, but if you list all the possible techniques available to a poet, tone is the only one that is not concrete. You can't point to a word or a line in a poem and say, that is tone. You might be able to say that is an image, and that image creates this tone, but that tone word that you use to describe the tone is itself going to be an abstraction by necessity. So observable elements are by definition observable. They are things you can point to. You can circle them with a pencil. Inferences by definition are things that you can't circle with a pencil. These are the abstract feelings that are generated by concrete elements. So that's my take on this. I'm not saying tone doesn't exist. I just think it's misplaced, and I think that if you try writing about it as if it is a technique, you're going to get bogged down really fast. Weaker claims are just going to sort of parrot these back to the reader. Here's a claim, and I like the one sentence introductory paragraph. There's no points. There are no points beyond the thesis to really be scored, and this is a thesis that would probably score you some points. A blank right here. maybe for a tone word to describe the mood of the images, maybe a word right here that's more concrete that describes what kind of imagery is being used in the poem, images of machinery and a bleak interior landscape, depict the landlady as, and here's where we would have some spots for more abstract tone language that characterizes her. And this but also is really important, because as long as you can fit and fill in something on both sides of a but also, you're guaranteed of writing about a complex portrayal. She's this and this, but also this. And if you can work some things against each other, you're guaranteed to be more specific, more creative in your response. Now, as far as outlines go, this is by far going to be the most popular approach. I think it's a bad idea. Most students are going to say, oh, 3 elements, there are my 3 paragraphs. They're probably going to find out that these things overlap. They're going to find out they don't know how to write about tone as a technique. And they're also, when they start talking about the effects, when they start trying to analyze these things, each paragraph is probably going to start repeating itself, because, you know, a lot of these details and images, they express the same things, you know. So in this second paragraph, you might start saying things like, the details also show her as nosy and a bad person. That's one reason I prefer to organize these responses according to my right side, the inferences and the shifts in tone, or the ways that a character contains complexity. So as quickly as possible, here is an outline that I might try to follow here. I think it makes sense to spend, notice the first 3 stanzas of this poem are almost entirely about not the landlady, but the people that live in her building, whose world that she inhabits, but in sort of a ghostly way. So it's all about the people. I think you've got a lot of points to score here just by sort of characterizing the social landscape of her world. Here's a possible claim, for example. The bleak imagery of the opening stanzas suggests the landlady is isolated in a landscape of detached and guarded tenants. What kind of things would we be pointing at here? So here I'm characterizing not her, I'm characterizing the tenants, but they're part of this landscape that she lives in, and I think that is certainly part of providing that complex portrayal of the landlady that they're asking about. What will we be talking about here? Well, notice all the mechanical imagery going on. They are trains. They close like shutters. Their faces are dialed to 0. There is something really dehumanizing about the people here. And I don't think it's the landlady's fault. I think there's a strong suggestion here that these people, they just are that way. Maybe she did something to annoy them in the past. We don't know. But largely, this is a faceless crowd that does not, at least in these first 3 stanzas, contain a lot of evidence of humanity, of internal sort of, of blood of any kind. So the imagery there's one point in, that you can ramble on about. Plenty of great images to sink your teeth into. And then discuss the effects. Something that a lot of people would probably miss here is the regularity of the meter, which is fascinating. If you look at that poem, it's almost perfectly iambic in some of those first stanzas. It is, forgive me, train-like almost in its regularity. It's clickety-clacking down the lane. Why is that relevant? It's not just the way that people wrote poems, because this poem is not written in that meter entirely. It abandons it once it shifts its focus to the landlady. What this is it's one more opportunity to talk about a technique that is supporting this idea of these tenants as kind of detached and distancing themselves from the landlady, but also from each other. So plenty to talk about them alone, and we've talked about multiple elements within one paragraph. That's totally fine. They're just multiple pieces of evidence used to characterize the social setting. I think my second and third paragraphs would probably be focused on 2 different sides of the landlady herself. One would just be, we'll go negative first to get that out of the way. It's easy. Here's a nice simple claim there. On the one hand, the speaker's depiction of the landlady is far from flattering. It's kind of it's a general claim. It's not a showstopper right there. That's okay. As long as we get to it by the end of the paragraph, we're going to be fine. It's signaling the direction the essay is going. All kinds of great language here. Her flesh is stippled. She's sneaking around. That's not a quote. Like a lover, she must know. There's a lot of great words here. She's hoping the worst about her tenants, and she dreams they dope, etc. A lot of these things, this is just low-hanging fruit here, and you can describe it any way you want. But she comes across as ghoulish, lonely, sickly, judgmental, melancholic, ungenerous, prying, a busybody. This is all analytical language that can be used to characterize this one side of her. Back to the meter then. When we start talking about her, we abandon the regularity of the iambic lines in favor of more jarring trochees at the beginning of a lot of these lines. Stippled, pads on, wonders. These are all words that begin lines, and I think if you try to read those out loud or in your head, you will hear a disruption of the meter, and I think it'd be an easy argument to make that this disruption of the meter reflects sort of an unsettled emotional state. And those are two pretty good points to make in one paragraph. You've got both imagery, or some of these descriptions of her, the greed of her. This is like not a positive depiction of lovers. It makes you wonder what is love like in this world that the speaker is living in. So that's one side. That's a pretty easy paragraph, pretty obvious. It's also a paragraph that you're not going to distinguish yourself from other people very much, because they might all be hitting some of those things. Almost no one is going to be talking about meter, though, because they're all terrified of it and they don't know how to talk about it. But it's easier than you think. I think that sets us up for a really interesting third paragraph that is much more sympathetic to the landlady. It also holds some sympathy for this lonely landlady. Pardon the alliteration here. Here's what I might suggest here. We can contrast the mechanical imagery of the tenants with more human imagery of her. She's the only one here described as having eyes and ears. Her skin, sure, it's stippled and sickly, but at least she's got it. She's the only one described as having a pulse. She wants to palm their skulls. It's sort of simultaneously ghoulish, but also it's a kind of yearning and a kind of loving in a way. She's desperate for connection in this world, and I don't think that the speaker here is blaming her for her trespasses so much. It also suggests that she gets to know these people even better than their friends, because she's the one privy to their hidden humanity, the books they read, what they eat. She knows the human processes that they do engage in, the curvature of their health, the clothes, what they eat, those kinds of things. So that's where we're starting to get to a more complex portrait of her. That could lead us to a nice conclusion. A lot of conclusions are useless. You shouldn't even bother unless you've got a new layer of meaning to attach to this. And a great thing to do here would be to make it about more than just the landlady, to talk about the culture implied by this poem. The imagery suggests a yearning for human connection denied to her by a world that would rather wall itself off. So maybe this is not unfamiliar territory from what we've already talked about, but maybe this is she comes across as a victim of a dehumanized urban landscape. You could make that point at the end of the prior paragraph, or you could make it in a conclusion. Either way, I think there are more than enough points here to score really well, and more points than you often see in the 8 or 9 sample essays. So that's my take. Again, yours is probably different, and that's totally cool.